I should have said no. When my son, George, asked if his new friend, Sebastian, could sleep over, something in my gut told me not to allow it. I didn't know why. I had barely met the boy, but there was something about him that made my skin crawl. Sebastian was polite, too polite. He always spoke in a soft, rehearsed tone, like he was imitating the way a child should sound rather than just being a child. He never laughed at jokes, never seemed fully engaged in play. And then there was the way he watched people, not with the usual curiosity of a kid, but with an eerie, studying gaze, as if he were memorizing every movement, every reaction. "Please, Mom," George had begged. "He's really cool, I promise." I hesitated. We had just moved to this town, and George didn't know anyone yet. Maybe I was just being overprotective. Maybe I was imagining things. So I forced a smile and agreed. That Friday night, when Sebastian's mother dropped him off, I expected the usual small talk that parents exchange before a sleepover. Instead, she barely met my eyes, shoving a duffel bag into my hands and mumbling something about picking him up early. "Thanks for having him," she muttered, before speeding away so fast that the tires screeched. I frowned, watching her car disappear down the street. Why did she seem so eager to leave? At first, everything was normal. The boys ate pizza, played video games, and built a blanket fort in George's room. They were having fun, but even then, I noticed small things about Sebastian that made me uneasy. He never called George by his name, only you. He didn't blink often. When he did, it was too slow, like a deliberate movement instead of something natural. And the worst part, he never seemed tired. By 10 p.m., George was already yawning, but Sebastian still sat up straight, his eyes too alert for a child who had spent all day running around. "Bedtime soon, boys," I called from the hallway. Sebastian turned his head toward me so slowly that it made my stomach drop. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I left the room with a tight feeling in my chest. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard the first noise, a faint whispering drifting from down the hall. At first, I thought it was just the boys talking in their sleep. But as I stepped into the hallway, I realized the whispers weren't coming from George's room. They were coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly open, the light casting a long, eerie shadow across the floor. I crept forward, my heart thudding. Through the small gap, I saw Sebastian standing in front of the mirror, whispering. "Yes, Mr. Jim," he muttered, his voice barely above a breath. I froze. Who was he talking to? "I did what you told me," he continued. "I'll do better next time." My skin prickled. Was he practicing lines? Talking to himself? No, I won't tell. "Her," Sebastian added, his hands gripping the bathroom sink. I couldn't move. Then his reflection twitched. Not his body, just his reflection. For a split second, it didn't match his real movements. Like something inside the mirror was out of sync. I gasped, stepping back. The floor creaked beneath me. Sebastian's head snapped around to look directly at me. I swear for half a second, his eyes looked wrong. Too dark, too hollow, too aware. "Mrs. Walters," he said, voice eerily calm. "I didn't know you were awake." I forced a smile, my pulse hammering. "Just checking on you, sweetheart. You should go back to bed." Sebastian stared at me for a moment too long. Then slowly, he smiled. "Yes." "Ma'am," he said, stepping out of the bathroom and walking past me down the hall. I stood there, heart racing, until I heard the soft creak of George's bedroom door closing. I should have checked on them. I should have ended the sleepover right then, but I didn't. I went back to bed, convincing myself that Sebastian was just a weird kid. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard George scream. I ran down the hall and burst into his room. George was sitting up in bed, pale as a ghost, his breath ragged. His blankets were crumpled, his eyes wild with fear. Sebastian, however, was still lying down, his back turned to us. "George, what happened?" I rushed to his side, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. His hands trembled as he gripped my wrist. "Mom," he whispered. "He was standing over me." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Sebastian," George croaked. "He was standing over my bed, whispering something, but he gulped. It wasn't his voice. A cold chill crawled down my spine. I turned toward Sebastian. He was still lying on the sleeping bag, completely still, too still. Then, slowly, he started laughing. A low, muffled chuckle pressed against the pillow. I grabbed George's arm and yanked him off the bed. "Come on, we're going downstairs." The second we stepped out of the room, Sebastian's laugh stopped. I slammed the door shut behind us, locking it. We stayed downstairs until morning. At sunrise, I called Sebastian's mother. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking, "but I need to know. Has Sebastian ever—" "I'll be there in 10 minutes, she interrupted. "Don't let him out of your sight." She arrived faster than I expected, practically dragging Sebastian to the car without a word. But before she drove off, she turned to me, her face pale and exhausted. "Has he mentioned Mr. Jim?" she whispered. I felt my blood turn to ice. "Yes," I choked out, her grip tightened on the steering wheel. "If he does again, don't let him in your house." And then she sped away. I never saw Sebastian again, but sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the faint sound of whispering, and I wonder if Mr. Jim ever really left. I used to believe my mother was just sick. That's what my father told me. That's what the church whispered behind closed doors. That's what the doctors tried to explain when they handed her bottles of pills. But I don't think it was sickness. Not anymore, because when I was a child, I saw something in her eyes, something that wasn't my mother at all. I grew up in a strict religious household. No TV, no sleepovers, no questioning God. My mother enforced every rule with an iron grip, quoting scripture like a weapon. "Temptation is the devil knocking," she'd say, gripping my wrist whenever I lingered too long near the radio. "Sin makes a home inside the weak," she'd whisper, eyes wide and unblinking. But it wasn't until I turned 12 that I started to fear her. It began with the nightmares. I dreamt that she stormed into my room in a violent rage, her face twisted with fury, her hands grabbing at my shoulders as she screamed in a voice that wasn't hers. I woke up gasping, and then the door creaked open, and she walked in. Her breath was ragged, her face pale, her eyes wild. She stood there for a long moment, staring at me in the darkness. Then, just like in the dream, she lunged. Her fingers dug into my shoulders, her breath hot against my face. This wasn't a dream. "Mom!" My voice came out weak, barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. She just stared, her pupils blown wide, her mouth twitching like she was trying to speak, but couldn't. Then she smiled. Not a warm, motherly smile. Something else. Something that made my stomach twist. "Did you think you could hide from me?" she whispered. I felt my blood turn to ice. "Mom, you're scaring me." Her grip tightened. Then just as suddenly as it started, she let go. She blinked, stepping back, her expression shifting like she had just woken up. "What are you doing up so late?" she asked, her voice completely normal. I sat there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. My arms still ached where her fingers had pressed into my skin. She didn't remember. She had no idea what she had just done, or at least that's what she wanted me to believe, because after that night, things only got worse. After that night, something changed in my mother. She would go days without speaking, just staring out the window with blank, unfocused eyes. Then, without warning, she'd snap back, cooking, cleaning, reciting Bible verses as if nothing was wrong. But I felt it. The thing inside her was getting stronger. It was the little things at first, the way her lips moved when no one was talking, the way she'd forget words, replacing them with something guttural and ancient sounding. Then one night I caught her standing in the backyard, holding a snake. She was terrified of snakes, always had been, but there she was, cradling it like a baby, her lips moving in a whisper I couldn't hear. I stepped onto the porch. "Mom?" She turned her head too slowly, her face stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. "Go back inside, sweetheart." I ran. After that, the church intervened. My father, desperate for answers, called in elders to pray over her. She sat stiffly in the pews, staring forward, grinning the entire time. Then one night she was gone. My father found her at the church. At 3 a.m., barefoot, standing in the dark. She was whispering to herself, laughing, waiting. When he brought her home, she didn't remember any of it, or at least that's what she said. Years later, I moved away, built a life far from that house. I tried to forget, but sometimes late at night my phone rings, and when I pick up, I hear her voice, laughing. I never questioned it at first. Sleepwalking runs in families, right? That's what the doctors said when my eldest son, Lucas, started wandering at night. They assured me it was common in children, something he would outgrow. At first, it was harmless. Some nights I'd find him standing in the hallway mumbling nonsense, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Other times, he'd shuffle toward the kitchen, open a drawer, and just stand there. But then things got stranger. One night, I woke up to a faint, rhythmic thudding. Knock, knock, knock. I followed the sound down the hallway and froze. Lucas was standing in the dark, his forehead pressed against the wall, gently knocking it over and over again. "Lucas," I whispered. No response. I stepped closer, my stomach twisting. I could hear his breath, ragged and shallow, like he was whispering something under it. I reached out, placed a hand on his shoulder, and he gasped awake. His body jolted violently, his hands shooting out to grab me as if he were falling. His eyes darted around in confusion. "Mom?" he croaked. "What happened?" "You were sleepwalking again," I said gently, trying to slow my racing heartbeat. He blinked at the wall, rubbing his forehead where it had been knocking. Then, in a small voice, he mumbled, "I was looking for the mirror." I didn't think much of what Lucas had said that night. There was no mirror in the hallway. Maybe it was just part of a dream, some random fragment his brain had pieced together while sleepwalking. But as the months passed, his episodes became more frequent. He was always drawn to the same spot in the hallway. Sometimes he would stand, completely still, facing the wall for minutes at a time. Other nights, he'd press his hands against it as if feeling for something. "Lucas, wake up," I'd whisper, gently shaking his shoulder. Each time he'd wake in a daze, blinking up at me with tired, unfocused eyes. "Did I do it again?" he'd ask. I'd nod, leading him back to bed. Then, one night he said something that made my blood run cold. "It's getting closer," I stiffened. "What is?" Lucas frowned, struggling to keep his eyes open. "The man in the mirror." A chill ran down my spine. There was no mirror in the hallway, or at least that's what I thought. Lucas eventually outgrew the sleepwalking. By the time he turned 10, the episodes became less frequent until they finally stopped. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking it was just one of those childhood phases. And for a while, life was normal, peaceful, until my youngest son, Noah, turned 5. One night, I woke up to a familiar sound. Knock, knock, knock. My breath hitched. No, it couldn't be. I slipped out of bed, my heart hammering, and crept down the hall. And there, standing in the exact same spot Lucas used to, was Noah, his tiny forehead pressed against the wall, knocking over and over. My body went cold. "Noah?" I whispered. He didn't move. I stepped closer, gently placing a hand on his back. He was whispering something. At first I couldn't make out the words, but as I leaned in, I found it. My stomach twisted. Noah turned to look at me, his eyes dull and unfocused. The mirror. It was always here. I stood frozen, my mind racing. There was no mirror in the hallway. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm. Noah blinked slowly, still half asleep. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the wallpaper. "It's behind here," he mumbled. Just like before. I swallowed hard. Before. Noah had never sleepwalked before this. How could he have known? A sick feeling settled in my stomach. My hands trembled as I pressed them against the wall. Something felt off. I knocked gently, and it sounded hollow. I called my husband, and the next morning, we peeled back the wallpaper, and that's when we saw it. A massive antique mirror built directly into the wall. The glass was dark, warped with age, too warped, like looking into murky water. My husband shuddered. Why the hell would someone cover this up? But I already knew, because as I stepped closer, my reflection didn't move right. For a split second, it lingered, watching me, before catching up. Noah gripped my arm, his little fingers digging into my skin. "He's still in there," he whispered. "We got rid of the mirror that same day, but sometimes when I walk past that hallway at night, I swear I still hear it. Knock, knock, knock."